Hi everybody, welcome to week 14 of HS 510, fall of 2020. We are now officially in the 20th century and we have two big topics to discuss. The first has to do with world wars and the second has to do with the emergence, rather explosive emergence, of world Christianity. So in this lecture, lecture 20, we'll talk about world wars, and in the final lecture, we'll talk about world Christianity. Here we go. There were a lot of theological and ecclesiastical changes that happened during the first half of the 20th century, particularly in Europe and especially in Germany. But to understand those changes, we need to do a little bit of contextual work. When World War I finally came to an end, everyone was ready for things to return to normal. But normal didn't ever really come because a depression hit the United States and most of Europe in 1929. The official years of the depression are 1929 to 1933, but the effects lasted all the way through World War II. And all I mean by depression is an extended time period of slowdown in buying and selling. That's what a depression is. So it meant if you're a business, you can't sell your product, even if you drop prices, and if you can't sell your product, you're starting to lay off people, and the more and more people that are out of work, that means they're not buying your products, and a lot of businesses start to close down. And eventually people start looking for answers. Maybe capitalism isn't so great after all. Maybe socialism is a better alternative. And what's the matter with the government? Why aren't they able to fix all of these problems? This is the sentiment that a lot of people had when the Depression hit. And by a lot, we're talking about millions and millions of people. In Germany, for example, 40% of the males were unemployed. And at least in part, this is part of the reason why someone like Hitler could come to power so quickly. People were discontent. And speaking of discontent, if a depression wasn't bad enough, the First World War ended badly for Germany. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of 1919, Germany shouldered the blame, and that blame included reparations. Basically, it meant that Germany owed billions of dollars to their neighbors, France, Great Britain, and Belgium. And they didn't have billions and billions of dollars, so they were borrowing money to pay it off. And to make matters worse, at least from a German perspective, they also lost a lot of land. Their borders were reduced back to what they had been in 1871, and the loss of land means the loss of resources. And if you don't have resources, your economy struggles even more. So in short, the outcome of World War I was a very bitter pill for Germans to swallow. And it's part of the reason why someone like Hitler was able to come to power so quickly and change so many things, including the church. Hitler wasn't actually from Germany. He was born in Austria in 1889. In his early 20s, he moved to Vienna because he wanted to be an architect and an artist. And that didn't really work out for him. He wasn't a very good student, and he started absorbing a lot of German nationalism and anti-Semitism. When World War I started, he joined the German army and delivered messages back and forth between the front lines and military headquarters. He received some significant military awards, an Iron Cross, because he was wounded twice. In 1918, he was temporarily blinded by gas, which resulted in hallucinations, and he later claimed these were actually visions about how he was the person appointed to save Germany. Anyway, after the war, he continued to serve in the military, and he was assigned the task of secretly observing a socialist workers' party to make sure that they weren't opposing the military. But he wasn't a very good spy, because he ended up joining the party he was supposed to be spying on and then taking over leadership of that party. And as the leader, he changed the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazi Party. And as a party, they emphasized nationalism, militarism, and anti-Semitism. And I guess it's worth noting that there were other groups that also emphasized anti-Semitism. Hitler wasn't necessarily unique in that regard. But anyway, the party line party outlined its ideology in 1920 with what they called the 25 points. These points are basically anti-capitalist, anti-Semitic, and pro-nationalistic. In addition, the 25 points called for the abolition of the Treaty of Versailles, which Germans already didn't like, and it called for the unification of Germany and Austria into what he called Greater Germany. So that's getting at the idea of nationalism. And then once this nation was in place, it would deny citizenship to Jews. So there's the anti-Semitism of the party. The thing about the Nazi Party is that they really liked rallies and parades and uniforms, so they were really good at mass appeal. And some war heroes joined the party, and that kind of, for a lot of people, made it seem legitimate. And pretty quickly, the Nazi Party had a variety of members, from workers to the wealthy. In 1923, Hitler staged an uprising against the German government. At the time, this is called the Weimar Republic. And it didn't work, and he ended up in prison. And this is when he writes his famous book, Mein Kampf, or like My Struggle or My Conflict. And he further develops his ideology. And the important thing about his imprisonment is that he learned that he would not be able to take control of the government by force. He wouldn't be able to overthrow the Weimar Republic. Instead, he would have to compete for votes like everybody else. And this meant he would have to organize the party, like other parties, regionally. And that is what he did, and he was really effective at it. From 1925 to 1929, party membership increased from 27,000 to 178,000. A lot of that growth came from young males. Hitler was really good at attracting the youth. Here's a quick quote from a young member who had recently joined this party, and he said that, quote, "For me, this was the start of a completely new life. There was only one thing in the world for me, and it was service in the movement. All my thoughts were centered on the movement. I could talk only of politics. I was no longer aware of anything else." Well, none of the other parties in Germany could generate that kind of enthusiasm. In 1930, the number of Nazis in the Reichstag, that's the parliament, increased from 12 to 107. It's out of a total of 577. By 1932, the Nazis had 800,000 members, and it was the largest political party in the Reichstag. And at this point, it wasn't long before Hitler had all the power. In January of 1933, the president, Hindenburg, was pressured to appoint Hitler as the chancellor. And then in February, there was a fire in the Reichstag building. Hitler convinced Hindenburg to decree that the government needed emergency powers. Those powers meant that the government suspended all rights. The next month, the Reichstag voted to dispense with the Constitution for 4 years so that they could address problems. This was called the Enabling Act. And with the Constitution out of the way, Hitler could act as he pleased. This included a policy of Die Gleichschaltung, which basically put all institutions under Nazi control. Gleichschaltung means leveling or bringing in line. In English, we might just call it Nazification. Basically meant that all political parties, except the Nazi Party, were abolished. Trade unions were abolished. Basically, anything that could resist the Nazi Party was eliminated or brought under Nazi control. Hindenburg died in 1934, and the Reichstag appointed Hitler as the sole leader. In hindsight, it seems astonishing that something like this could happen so quickly. But again, you have to remember the context of discontentment. People were really irked by the Treaty of Versailles. And remember all of those issues with unemployment? Between 1934 and 1937, the unemployment in Germany dropped from 2.6 million to less than 500,000. So this made a lot of Germans feel as though the Nazis were genuinely improving things, even if they were excessive. And Hitler was good at making people feel like they were part of something. Again, that's part of the reason why he was able to change so many things, and as we'll see in a second, change the church. At this point, I'm not going to cover all of the contours and atrocities of the war and the Holocaust. I suspect that you probably are already somewhat familiar with World War II. Maybe you read Elie Wiesel's book Night in high school, or maybe you read Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. Maybe you even have met someone who served in World War II. As a young man, my grandfather was a student at Iowa State, and then he left school to go serve in World War II. But in a nutshell, Germany begins to aggressively make advances in Europe. They reoccupy territories along the Rhine, they annex Austria, and then once they invade Poland in September of 1939, Great Britain and France declare war, and the world is once again in the middle of this huge conflict. I mentioned a few moments ago that when Hitler came to power, he implemented a policy of Gleichschaltung, which sought to make everything unified under the Nazi Party. That agenda was directed toward the church as well. On April 7th, 1933, the Aryan Paragraph was passed by the Reichstag. It basically said that all Jews, including people who had even some distant Jewish descent, had to be removed from any kind of civil service. This included anyone who worked in a church, Protestant or Catholic. So even if you were Jewish and had converted to Christianity, it didn't matter. Church membership was rooted in ethnicity or racial sameness, not in a person's allegiance to Jesus Christ. From the Nazi perspective, they could do this because the church received government funding. So all those things that church workers do, things like weddings and funerals and baptisms, they were considered part of civil service. So anyone and anything Jewish, including the Old Testament, were basically kicked out of the church. At this time, all these different German churches from different territories were united into a single church, a German Protestant Reich Church, or a Deutsche Evangelische Kirche. This was a major change in how the church and state related. Since the time of the Reformation, churches had been defined by regions, and now they were agreeing to unite as a single national church under the direction of a Reich bishop. That bishop, by the way, Ludwig Müller, was a friend of Hitler and a hardcore Nazi, and he emphasized one Reich, one church. Again, it's really difficult in hindsight to understand how so many people in the German church went along with all of this. And even in university theology departments, people submitted to Nazi influence. For example, by the end of 1933, 90% of the student body in the Berlin theology department had joined the Nazi Party. Just think about that. 90% of the students in one of the world's most prestigious theological departments, students who were there to reflect on Jesus Christ and Scripture, joined the Nazis. But not everyone joined. There were Christians who refused to submit to Nazi ideology in the Reich Church, and these individuals are usually referred to as the confessing church. They weren't all alike, but they galvanized around rejecting, one, the formation of a single Reich church, and two, the Aryan Paragraph, that policy of removing all things Jewish. So they had a synod, a church gathering in May of 1934, and they put together a statement of resistance, the Barmen Declaration. Well, in a second, I'll have you pause the presentation and read the document. And it's important that you keep all of this historical context in mind. Hopefully you'll be able to understand the significance of the words. Some of the declarations are simply passages from the New Testament, and they affirm the centrality of Jesus. Or it might quote from like John 14 or 1 Corinthians 1. But the declaration will also denounce certain ideas and claims. So at this point, I'll have you pause the presentation and take out the Bentonson text and read through the Barmen Declaration, and then we will move forward. Well, there's a lot going on in the Barmen Declaration, but hopefully you notice that as a whole, It's basically rejecting everything that Hitler and the Nazis and the new German church is doing. It's repudiating the idea that the church should somehow adapt its message to fit with a political ideology, or that it's the church's job to serve the state and the things that the states are doing. Well, the declaration was signed by a variety of members of the confessing church, and one of those signees was a person named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who we will talk about next. Dietrich Bonhoeffer didn't actually attend the Barmen Synod, but he did sign it. However, Bonhoeffer never really felt that the Barmen Declaration went far enough. More specifically, he thought it was too general, and it didn't come down hard enough on concrete issues like anti-Semitic policy. So here's a little bit of background on Bonhoeffer, and then we'll look at some of his other writings. Bonhoeffer was born in 1906, and his story didn't really follow the same pattern as other early 20th century Protestant theologians in Germany. In general, theologians tended to be the sons of ministers. But Bonhoeffer's father was a renowned neurologist, Karl Ludwig Bonhoeffer. Karl, by the way, did not like Sigmund Freud. He also didn't particularly like Christianity. When his mother read from Luke 2 at Christmas time, his father would get all grumpy and say things like, "I understand nothing of that." Nevertheless, Dietrich was drawn toward the church, and by age 13, he decided that he wanted to be a theologian. For his father and older brothers, this was crazy. As the story goes, they tried to talk him out of it by saying, "Look at the church, a more paltry institution one can hardly imagine." And then Bonhoeffer, not missing a beat, replied, "In that case, I will reform it." Well, part of the reason his family wasn't excited about Bonhoeffer becoming a theologian was that he was really, really talented, and they felt that theology was just a retreat from reality. Dietrich was a very gifted musician, and a lot of people thought he might become a concert pianist. That seemed like a more prestigious path. But Bonhoeffer stuck with his plan to become a theologian, and by the time he was 15, he was reading theological tomes about church history, and he was signing his name Dietrich Bonhoeffer, theologian. One thing to note about Bonhoeffer, especially when you consider the direction that his life and career took, is that he was a person with a lot of privilege. His family was wealthy. So in addition to completing not one but two dissertations, he would travel to places like Rome and North Africa and Cuba, and he would attend operas and concerts in all of these different cosmopolitan cities. There's one year in particular that I should mention. In 1930, he was awarded a fellowship at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And Union was one of the United States' more prestigious divinity schools. And Bonhoeffer was not impressed at all with American theology. He wrote in his journal that American theology classes and discussions sounded like, quote, blather of first semester freshmen. And when he encountered some of the modernist pastors and theologians coming out of the kind of modernist fundamentalist debate, he didn't have anything positive to say. When he heard one American modernist theologian preach, this guy named Harry Emerson Fosdick, he complained that the sermon was nothing more than, quote, parenthetical church remarks about newspaper events. But he did find encouragement in an unexpected place. A fellow classmate invited him to attend a black church in Harlem, and Bonhoeffer was really moved by what he experienced. And he commented that it was, quote, the only time he had experienced true religion in the United States. Part of what impressed Bonhoeffer was witnessing the faith of people who were oppressed. And when he returned to Europe, he always kept a copy of a book called Book of American Negro Spirituals. Well, his return to Germany coincided with the rise of Nazi power. And not only was he troubled by how Christians were absorbing Nazi propaganda, but even many of his former professors, including the person who directed one of his dissertations, had joined the Nazis. And as I noted earlier, he was one of the signers of the Barmen Declaration, so he aligned himself with the confessing church. And with no chance of joining a university faculty, because they were all controlled by the Nazis, he started an illegal underground seminary to train ministers of the confessing church. That was in 1935. Part of what Bonhoeffer wanted to teach his students was how to live in total dedication to the Lord within genuine Christian community. And that's the setting of probably his most famous book, which is not in our reader, called Discipleship, or now it's sometimes called The Cost of Discipleship. Well, just to finish off this abridged biography, the seminary was discovered and closed by the Gestapo. And here's something that's quite remarkable about Bonhoeffer. His American friends urged him to leave Germany as the war approached, and he did. But then he immediately felt that it was the wrong thing to do. And he wrote a letter to Reinhold Niebuhr back in the United States, and he said, quote, "I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people." Bonhoeffer was a pacifist, but he was convinced that it was worth setting that conviction aside to participate in a plot to assassinate Hitler. But prior to that attempt, it was discovered. Bonhoeffer was arrested, and in April of 1945, he was executed. And it was just a matter of days before the Allied forces liberated the camp that he was in. At this point, I'll have you pause the presentation and take out your Bentonson text. And there's a segment from Bonhoeffer from a collection called Letters and Papers from Prison. So contextually, Bonhoeffer is writing this during his imprisonment, where he's under Nazi captivity. And that's forcing him to spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a Christian. What does it mean to do theology? What should be the object or the center of our theology, and what it should look like in the world? So take a couple of minutes and read through those paragraphs and maybe spend a little time reflecting on Bonhoeffer and what he might have to say to us today. A lot of people are really interested in Bonhoeffer right now, and there's been kind of an explosion of different books and resources about Bonhoeffer. Here are two that I might draw your attention to if you're interested in getting to know him a little better. The first is called Strange Glory, A Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer by Charles Marsh. It's a big book, and it's a really thorough book, but I think this is probably the biography that does the best job in terms of capturing the context, the German culture, and it has a pretty critical kind of interpretation of Bonhoeffer, so that's something you might take a look at. The other is a much smaller book called Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letter and Papers from Prison. Princeton University Press has a book series right now that are biographies on influential books. So, for example, they have there's a biography on C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And there's also one by Martin Marty on the Letters and Papers from Prison. And again, it's a shorter kind of book, but if you're interested in getting a little more on the context and the influence of Bonhoeffer, particularly through his works composed while he was imprisoned, then I would start with this book by Martin Marty. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I will see you in the next and final lecture of the course.